Welcome. This is the first time conference attendance workshop at the Great Lakes Bio conference in 2021. I want to just start by doing some introductions. So those of us that are working on organizing this are going to start. I'm Layla Oesper. I use she, her pronouns. I am an assistant professor of computer science at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. And my research area that I'm interested in, it relates to cancer genomics. And so I study and design algorithms that analyze DNA sequencing data from cancer patients, in particular, looking at how we infer the evolutionary history of a tumor from that type of data. And I am just really delighted to be here today to get to meet all of you and to get to share some information about what it's like to attend your first conference. It's an activity that I think is really exciting. And I am just delighted that all of you are going to be attending GLBIO this year. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Gitch to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Onsongo. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Macalester College. I use he, him, his. My area of research is, for a long time, I did clinical genomics research. I wrote software that's used in the clinic for genetic testing. When you write software that gets used in the clinic, there's some things you have to worry about, like patient, privacy that you don't necessarily do when you're doing research. So I worked on that. Lately, I've been moving towards agricultural informatics, and a lot of the work I'm doing there is figuring out how we can take plant breeding data that's mostly archived in PDFs and turn it into some kind of structure that we can actually mine and use for doing research. I'm really excited for this workshop. I wish a workshop like this existed when I first attended my first conference. So I'm looking forward to sharing a thing or two about attending conferences. So I am going to hand over to Robin.
Thanks, Gitch. Hey, I'm Robin Shields-Cutler. I'm also at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. I use he, him, his, and I'm an assistant professor in the biology department. So my background, I initially trained as a microbiologist and mostly just used Excel to do mathy things, and then got into computational biology and bioinformatics during my postdoc. And now I work on various microbiome data sets, so I'm kind of merging those things. And some studies in human cohorts, looking at some recipients of stem cell transplants. And then I also have a number of studies in non-human primates, both primates located in zoos and in the wild. So my interest within some of that is on how these communities are structured and some of the biochemical interactions and potential within those communities and how that influences the structure of that ecology. Yeah, I'm also excited to share this space. I wish that we could be in a room and floating around and doing it in person, but we will manage and hopefully pick up a few things along the way. I'm excited to learn a few things as well. It's always something new to learn. So welcome, and I'll pass it to Freddie now.
Hi, everybody. My name is Freddie. I'm a junior rising senior at Macalester College, and I study applied mathematics and statistics, and public health is like a unifying theme in like what I do. So I have been a research assistant at the University of Minnesota in their like division of epi and clinical research, and like what I do specifically is looking at how gene expression is influenced by a bunch of different demographic factors in pediatric cancer, and then also like using that to explain why some pediatric cancers, have differing survival disparities by race, sex, class, whatever. And eventually I want to continue that, go into more like minority health survival disparities, but in LGBTQ plus communities and a bunch of other stuff. My pronouns are they, she. You can alternate, you can use either, no big deal on that one. And I'm really excited to help out. I was actually able to go to my first ever conference because of Layla and Gitch about a year ago, and it was a really, really nice experience for me. So yeah, nice to see you guys.
Great, fabulous. So now that you know a little bit about us, the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a chance to actually start to get to know a little bit about each other. And so in this workshop, we're going to do a number of sort of breakout room activities. Before I sort of send you off on this, I just want to make a reminder that we are an incredibly diverse collection of people in this Zoom call. We are ranging from high school students through undergrads, through master's students, PhD students. But the thing that we all have in common is we are all interested in wanting to come to this session about first-time conference attendance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this both in the chat on Zoom, but I'm also going to post it in Slack, is a link to a little document. And so I'm posting it in the general channel in Slack. And so this is just a couple questions for you to talk about with people in your breakout room. So introduce yourself, so your name and any other information about how you prefer to be referred to, what institution you're currently at, why you're attending Great Lakes Bio. And a fun little question of, if you weren't doing computational biology or bioinformatics, what is it that you would want to be doing or studying instead? So we're gonna send you off into breakout rooms of about 5 folks for a little bit, and then we'll pull you back in here. So Gitch, I'll sort of, oh,
All right. I have created, I'll open the breakout rooms and the organizers will, or did you already create it?
I did not.
Okay, I'll create it. The organizers, you can just jump out of the breakout room.
There seems to be an issue with the link.
I'm working on it.
Okay, thank you.
Done. All right, I think you should be able to access it now. All right, welcome back. So hopefully you now know at least a couple other people that are going to be attending the conference. So networking and getting to know people is going to be a theme that you'll see throughout the next hour and 45 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to move on to the next part of this workshop, which is really going to be about conference nuts and bolts. And so really what actually happens at a conference and how to make a plan to make the best use of your time. So as I'm doing this, I want to encourage you that if you do have questions that come up, you can always use the chat function on Zoom and ask your questions that way. And I'll definitely, we'll have people that are paying attention to see if there are questions that are in there. So let me know. So with that, let's get going. So here's sort of an overview of the things that we're going to talk about for the next half an hour. So what are the kinds of things that happen at a conference? And then in particular, how do questions at the end of a talk work? And then I'll give you some hints about how to make a plan for your conference attendance. And then the last part of this section is going to be a chance for you to get some hands-on time to actually start putting together your plan for Great Lakes Bio 2021. All right, so what kinds of things actually happen at a conference? So there's a number of different types of talks that you would see at a conference. And so I'm going to go through a couple of these different talks or types of sessions that'll happen, give you a little bit more details about each one. And then in particular for some of these, we'll talk about specific things that are happening at Great Lakes Bio this year. So the first type of talk is something that's called a keynote talk. And so keynote talks are where the scientists that are giving the talks are actually personally invited by the organizers of the conference. These are usually going to be longer talks. They'll usually be about 45 minutes long and followed by some time for questions from the audience. And so typically these talks are going to be given by more established researchers, although not always the rule. And what this also means is the scope of these talks is going to tend to be a little bit more broad. It's going to be a talk that's for the general audience at the entire conference rather than a specific subset of the individuals. And so what this means is they also tend to be a little bit more accessible to a wider audience. So I think these are a really good type of talk to take note of as a first-time conference attendee. Keynotes tend to be really interesting, really well done talks. And so I'd encourage you that if you have the time in your schedule to actually be able to attend the keynotes, that's usually a really good rule of thumb for starting to think about your attendance and say, all right, let me start with the keynotes and then build my schedule from there. So that's the first main type of talk that's going to happen at a conference. And so at GLBIO this year, we've got 4 different keynote speakers. I've got a link on here onto the website that tells you some information about each of their individual talks and exactly when they're happening. So for us, they're going to be the first talk of the day for a couple of days and then the last talk of the conference. And so just a couple highlights on here. So Lauren does some really cool things with machine learning and bioinformatics. Noel, who's at the University of Minnesota, who works in things with the veterinary department. Michael Osterholm is also at the University of Minnesota, as a name that you maybe have heard. He's actually part of the scientific advisory team for the current presidential administration. And then lastly, Nadia El-Malbrook, who's someone that I've known for a long time in the field, does some really cool, very algorithmic computational work. So all 4 of these talks should be really interesting. And I personally am really looking forward to going to all of them. So the second main type of talk is going to be what I'll call a contributed talk. And so these talks are usually going to be ones that are by scientists that submit an abstract or a full paper about really recent work or work that's currently in progress. And it's going to go through some amount of peer review before it gets accepted for a talk. And so these will usually be a summary of a particular project as opposed to a keynote that's going to be a little bit more broad, maybe covering multiple different projects or thinking about a particular area. And so in the schedule, these types of talks are usually going to be organized into smaller groups called sessions. So there might be a session that's called Cancer Genomics that'll have 3 talks together that are all going to be related to something with bioinformatic analysis of cancer. So in general, these talks are going to be given by a whole range of different people, from student trainees to postdocs to professors to even individuals from industry. And so I just stuck on the bottom here a list of the different sessions or session topics that are happening at Great Lakes Bio this year. Again, you can find all of this information off of the website. And so thinking about sessions or sort of larger topics that you're interested in can also be something that's useful for you as you start to put together what your schedule of talks and things that you want to attend is going to look like. So a third kind of talk or event that happens at a conference is a panel or panel discussions. And so these are going to involve a group of scientists, usually from all levels. Sometimes they might be from they might all be students, or they might all be established professors, depending on the topic. And they're going to sort of discuss something about a particular topic. And so this could be a very scientific area. So saying, let's talk about where we see things going as single cell sequencing is continuing to develop. It could be something that's a little bit more about sort of the community as a general. So, how do we better support grad students that are just starting into programs? So the type of topics for panels can vary incredibly widely. So there's only one panel that is happening as part of Great Lakes Bio this year. And this is a panel that's going to be on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So you might have noticed that you might have gotten an email recently that was asking you to fill out a survey about sort of some of these types of questions. And so this panel is really going to be a chance for us as a community to think about some of these issues and what we're doing and where we want to go. So that's another one that I encourage you, that if you're able to fit it into your schedule, I think should be an interesting discussion. And is something that Great Lakes Bio in particular, I think, is really interested in thinking about and learning from all parts of our community, from our first-time conference attendees all the way to people that have been coming to these conferences every year, to think about what do we want to do as a community. So the last type of event I'll talk about at a conference is a poster session. And these look a little bit different in person and virtual, so I'll give you a little glimpse of each one. So in person, this means that you actually literally create a poster, and they'll have a hallway with lots of people with posters and a chance for people to just walk around and talk to different scientists. I think about poster sessions really as just a great way of starting a conversation with someone new. It's a great chance to just like walk around and say, oh, that title looks really interesting. Let me go chat with that person about that. In the virtual world, they look a little bit different. So a lot of times it might just be a PDF. There might be a video that's associated with it. And the conversation and questions will happen by a Q&A application usually. So similar to contributive talks, these are the result of the scientists submit some sort of abstract. It's going to cover a new work, or sometimes a lot of times something that's just a work in progress. So maybe it's not ready to be published yet, but this is an opportunity for scientists to get feedback from the community about the work that they're doing and how others might use it. And these are given by a mix of different levels, trainees, postdocs, professors. I find that posters tend to be a little bit more of the newer people to the field. So I think there's a lot of them are given by students and postdocs. In fact, I imagine there might be some people on this call that are in fact going to be presenting their posters next week. So those are 4 main types of things that happen at a conference. And so I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the questions that happen at the end of a lot of these different types of talks and how those work, who that's for, and things that might be useful to keep in mind as you explore the world of conference attendance. So pretty much in every conference, there's going to be time reserved at the end of the talk for questions. And really anyone can ask a question. Questions can range from things of just asking for clarification on something that was said, a follow-up question of, oh, have you thought about this particular thing? And so really, scientists love getting feedback on their work. And so questions are a really great way for you to get information, but also for the speakers to find out what people are thinking about their work. So in-person conferences, there's usually going to be a microphone, or maybe you raise your hand and a runner will bring a microphone to you and the speaker will call upon you to answer questions. In the virtual world, there's usually going to be some sort of question and answer application or box. And then the moderator, which is the person who's sort of like running the session and making sure everything stays on time, will typically then read out those questions and the speaker will then answer it at that time. So again, I just want to encourage you that if you have a question after a talk, you absolutely can ask it. I love getting questions from students when I give talks at conferences. And so just wanted to make sure that it's clear that that really is something that is for everyone. Okay, so I've given you a lot of information about the mechanics of a conference. So what's involved, what does it look like? And I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how do you best plan what you're going to do at a conference and how you're going to make good use of that time. So the first thing with this is I think it's really, really helpful to actually have a plan for what you're going to do at a conference. It can be a little bit overwhelming to just be like, there are so many talks and there's so many things. And so spending a little bit of time up front to think about what is really interesting to you can be time that's really well spent. So I've already been trying to give you a couple hints as I've been going through this about places that are good to start. So keynotes, I think, are a really good thing to put on your schedule if you're able to make them. Searching for sessions that have topics that are interesting to you. Another thing that I tend to do, and I think that this is something that if you continue to go to conferences might be helpful, but looking for talks that are by people you know, because you will start to get to know people. That's one of the really cool things with conferences is if you keep going to them, you start seeing the same people over and over again. And so that's definitely something that I do when I sit down to make my plan. Another point that I think is really important to remember, and I've gotten a lot of questions from students about this in the past, is do I have to go to everything? And my answer is really resoundingly no. Like, actually, please don't go to everything. You might just completely wear yourself out. I think it's really important to remember that you can take breaks, but also that going to a conference isn't just about going to the talks. It's about interacting with the other people at the conference. And so saying, I'm going to skip this session, but maybe I'll go hang out in this networking room or this virtual networking room, or in your case, maybe you'll spend some time chatting on Slack with some of the other individuals that are on our Slack page about, hey, I went to this talk. This thing was really cool, but I had these questions. Was anyone else there? Can be a really great way to spend your time. And so just really as a reminder of make sure to talk to others to get ideas of what to attend. I know a lot of times I've ended up going to sessions because I ran into someone in the hallway and they were like, oh, I'm going to this session. Like this person is supposed to like do something really cool. And I've been like, oh, all right, I'm just going to follow you there. And I've been able to see really cool things. So that's just sort of, I'll call them Layla's tips and tricks on figuring out what you should go to at a conference. I want to give you some more specific information just for Great Lakes Bio. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, hopefully. And so hopefully you can see the website that I've got up here. All right, awesome. All right, so a couple things to know. So there's a couple really useful places for information when you're putting together your schedule. So right now I'm on the GLBIO website. And so I want to point you to over on the left, there's program and schedule. And there's two things that are really important here. So there's schedule at a glance. So if I click on this, this is going to give me a really high level idea of the conference. And so telling me the days, the high level times, and then just the general names of the sessions. So one thing to note with this is what we call a 2-track conference. So there's really 2 main rooms. So there's always going to be 2 talks going on at the same time, except for things like keynotes and the panel. And so, you know, when you're looking at things and deciding, you want to make sure that you're not going to try to go to 2 different talks at exactly the same time. So that's the schedule at a glance. Below it is also the detailed agenda. So I'm just going to click on the general session. And this is going to give you a lot, well, when the internet resolves better. All right, well, my internet is slow today, but it'll still show you that you have all of the information that's here. Normally it looks a little bit more pretty, but this will give you the information on the title of the talk, the time, who's talking, for every single talk that's happening. When the internet is not being incredibly slow, there is also links on here that you can click on to see the abstract for every single one of these talks. So just knowing that those resources are there can be really useful for putting together your schedule. Another resource that can be useful for that is actually going to be the ShowCare website that you got a login to when you got information about the conference. So this is the ShowCare website. All I've done right now is I've just logged into it. And we can see a couple things, that there's sort of an upcoming events session on the left. There's some different sort of sessions on here, things like the poster hall. But what I want to point you to is over on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a little button that's for full schedule. And so if I click on this, it brings me into something that looks like the high-level schedule. And so the nice thing about this is you can actually use this as a place to put your schedule together. So if I'm looking at this, I'm really interested in cancer genomics. So I'm like, oh, I definitely want to make sure I go to that session. So if I'm going to click on here and it gives me a couple of options, it's showing me specifically the individual talks that are happening here. But I also have the option to add it to my calendar so that I know exactly what time it's happening. This might be really useful for some of you that are in different time zones to make sure that you've got that conversion right done on your calendar. Or I can just add it to my schedule. And you can see that things that I've added in here have now turned yellow. And so I've got everything sort of in one place to allow me to figure out what it is that I want to go to. All right, so that is sort of the high level pieces of information that I have for you about sort of how to think about the nuts and bolts of a conference, but also sort of deciding what you might want to go to. All right, so the thing that I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to give you another activity. And so I have a document here. I'm going to stick the link on both Slack and in the chat. And so what I want you to do in your breakout rooms is I want you to look through and try to find a few sessions that you think are interesting. You can share these with the others in your breakout room. If you've gotten something that you all think is really interesting, you can post it onto the Slack channel for what to go to. And I want you to use the next 10 or 15 minutes to start putting together your schedule for what you think you're going to do in your time at Great Lakes Bio. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And before I send you off into breakout rooms, I just want to see, what questions do you have?
I'm still a little confused about the EDI panel introduction. Could you please just give a little more background about it, or maybe I missed some information? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're doing something a little bit different with this panel, and I think the structure is going to be a little different than what you might see in other conferences. So you got the questions that were emailed to you, and then you realize there's sort of an EDI panel introduction one day, and then a full panel the later day. And so that introduction is really going to be a chance for the panelists that are going to be running the full panel to get some feedback, more feedback from the community, to pose some questions to us to think about for the next couple of days before we have the full panel where we have a chance to ask them questions. So I'd really think about that as a short session that's going to be a primer that's going to effectively get us all thinking about things maybe on a similar page or a similar type of questions, so that when we have that panel, it can be a good and sort of fully formed conversation. So we've all had a little bit of time to start thinking about those topics. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Any other questions?
All right. Should I open up the rooms?
Yeah, go for it, Gitch.
Okay.
Salim, I see your hand up while we're waiting for people to filter back. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I got a quick question. So I signed up for the Bayesian networking, but I see that it's getting canceled. And then I noticed that this video session is being recorded. I was wondering, does like the intro to deep learning and creating neural networks in Python and R workshop also being recorded that we can watch later on our own? Just because I know there was like, you had to be on a wait list for that because it was overly packed. So are any of these sessions going to be recorded and placed somewhere?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is a guess as an answer. This session is being recorded because it's going to be posted later on, I think, ISCV TV. I believe the other sessions will be posted there as well. I don't know for sure, but if I can work on getting an answer to some of these questions, and when I have it, I will post it into the Slack. So take a look at the Slack. If I'll stick stuff like that in there. I also heard a couple of you didn't have access to ShowCare and hadn't gotten that email. So that's another thing that I'm going to follow up with the organizers of the conference. The wonderful world of virtual things. But I'll definitely post any answers or lessons I learned from that into the Slack channel.
I have one more question.
So hang on just a second. So I'm just gonna say, like, I know Zoom is a lot, and we've probably all spent a lot of time on Zoom in the past year. So the next minute or two, is just if you need to like step away and turn your computer off, go stretch, go do that. And we'll aim to get the next session started at probably about 1:48. All right, so Salim, another question?
Yeah, so like when we want to go to like the keynote speakers or just like the general sessions and the panels, is this all on a Zoom link? Just because I also couldn't access my showcase, I think that's what it was. So like, how do we access all these different rooms?
Yeah, so all of this is supposed to be through ShowCare, which you should have gotten the link through. So ShowCare is kind of like a fancy front end for Zoom, so it'll still feel like Zoom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow up with the organizers of the conference and find out if something happened, if like all of those emails haven't gone out. But all of it, to my knowledge, will be through ShowCare and that website. So I'm going to work on figuring out what's going on with that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Can you see my slides?
I can see them.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of help us talk about networking or lead this next session. So I'm going to talk about networking, and the way I want you to think about networking is it's just a way to find, build, and utilize connections. So before I jump into networking, I will share this. When I started, I guess when I was finishing college, and I heard about networking, it always felt like it is this thing that you have to do to like get a job. And like culturally, I grew up in a way where you don't get to meet people just so you could get something from them. And it's one of those things that I was just never comfortable with it. But after a while, it just came to understand it as this is just a way of like meeting people and get to know people. And that's how you get to know about like interesting things people are doing and opportunities that you could take advantage of. So I want you to kind of think about this in those terms, and I would just kind of give a little bit of like some basic things about networking. But something I want you to keep in mind is we are all very different. Some things that work for some people don't work for everyone else. So I want you to think about like doing what works for you. Okay, so we're going to talk about what's networking, how do you do it, questions to ask. These are just to get you started, but I also want you to realize that context matters, but this is just a few questions that will get you started. And then we're going to talk about exiting a conversation. I think when I started networking, this was one of the harder things to do. And then we'll talk about follow-up after you've met somebody at a conference, and it's afterwards you want to follow up. And then you're going to do a little activity at the end so you can practice networking a little bit. Okay, so what is networking? So this is an information exchange, and it's just building relationships, and they can advance your career. And there's nothing wrong with that. I know in some contexts it might seem like, brown nosing, but don't think about it that way. It can help advance your career, but you're just building relationships. So something else to realize here. So this is not like a quick fix to find a job. Most students, when you're about to graduate, you always hear, okay, you should network, but this is something you should be doing all the time, not just when you're about to graduate or when you want to find a job. Okay, so how do you do it? So the first thing is to introduce yourself, and you've already done this in the breakout rooms where you got to meet other participants. So this is not different than just like introducing yourself. And just be curious, ask questions. People in general like to talk about themselves, and do pay attention to what they're saying. So if you need to like ask a follow-up question, it helps when somebody asks you a follow-up questions based on something that you've just said. It shows that you've been paying attention. All right, so like anything else, it actually helps to prepare. So if you're going for a conference, depending on the conference, you're most likely going to meet professors, meet postdocs, meet other students. Have a question or two. If you, introduce yourself to somebody and they say, hey, I'm an assistant professor, or I'm a full professor, my lab does this, it'll be a good idea to have like one or two questions that you could ask them that are context specific. If it's a fellow student, that means you can ask slightly different questions. If it's a postdoc and it's a fellow postdoc, or you're a student, a postdoc, just having one or two questions that you could ask helps like with the networking process. All right, so here's another thing. So you're an expert in yourself, so be confident, when you're introducing yourself. Remember, it's not like you're trying to get a job, you're just meeting somebody, just introduce yourself. Now, in regular pre-COVID times, the general advice is like, have a strong handshake, but we will see if this will survive post-COVID. Already, people are hesitant to shake hands, so we'll see what happens. And then it's generally considered good to make eye contact with a little bit of caveat. So there's some cultural specific context here. So in the US in general, it's considered you're paying attention if you look somebody in the eye when you're shaking your hand. But keep in mind that in certain communities, it's not considered appropriate. So just keep in mind if you know you're in a different context, or if you talk to somebody and they're not looking you in the eye, it could be there's a reason why they're not doing that. So just something to keep in mind. All right, and it always helps to have like a 5-second headline of you, who you are. So here's mine as an example. You know, I'm having coffee at a conference and I'm about to walk out. There's somebody who's standing there. I want to introduce myself. I go, hi, I'm Getiria Onsongo. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Macalester College. So I've already given some basic information about myself. If this person is a computer scientist, oh, there's something there we have in common. If let's say I want to maybe tell them more, maybe it's an agroinformatics conference, then I'll maybe introduce myself slightly differently. Hi, I'm a computer science professor at Macalester College. This is what I do for my research. All right, so here are some just sample questions to get you started. And as I said, you know, I always find it easy to have like a boilerplate where you're starting from, but keep in mind that, you know, context matters here. So for example, you're at a conference, here's some questions you could ask. What are some interesting talks or posters you've seen at the conference? And that's just a good way to start a discussion. Or what's your area of interest or research? This is somebody you maybe haven't met before. I've been to conferences with Layla. I wouldn't go and say, hey, Layla, I haven't seen you in a while. What's your area of interest or research, right? Because I have met Layla before. So if it's someone in your area of interest, so if you're going to a conference, chances are there's a specific area you're working on, and that's why you're attending that specific conference. And let's say, you know, there's somebody, you know, in this particular area, maybe they're going to be giving a keynote talk. Typically, if they're giving a keynote, then that's an area they're interested in. Just having a little bit more specific questions you can ask. You know, I'm interested in X, where X is something very specific. Maybe you watch them give a keynote talk, and then you see them, you know, outside. You could say, hey, I really enjoyed your talk. You know, I'm interested in, and then something very specific. And then, you know, if you're just getting into the field, you can say, I'm someone who works in this area. Do you have advice for me as I get started in this field? And that's just a good way of like having that conversation and, you know, getting to know someone. So just think of it as just forming this relationship. And here's the tip. Don't say something like, I'm interested in computational biology, right? Like that's a really broad topic. All right. So exiting a conversation, so be polite and respectful. So obviously this is slightly different in a virtual setting. I saw a joke on Twitter, somebody saying, you know, you mean soon we're going to have to talk to people in person and I just can't leave a meeting when I'm done with it, right? In Zoom, after the meeting, you can just exit Zoom and leave. But in one-on-one or, you know, in-person conferences, you know, don't just dart out when somebody's in the middle of a sentence. So be polite and respectful. And also be authentic. You know, when I started going to conferences or networking in general, it always felt weird, you know, odd telling somebody you have to leave. I don't want them to think I'm not interested in what they're talking about. I don't want them to think I'm bored, you know, so it becomes this funny dance of like, how do I exit this conversation? And then you say something like, I need to go to the bathroom so that they don't, you know, people understand, you know, sometimes you just have somewhere else to do. Just be authentic and be straightforward, you know. Don't say you need to go to the bathroom if you don't, you know, you can just say, you know, I need to head out. And I'll give an example of like something you can say if you want to exit a discussion. And also it's okay to make an ask if it's appropriate. So if it's somebody very specific in a very specific area. So I'll go back to when I was in graduate school and I was considering postdoc positions. And I just talked to somebody, had a great conversation in an area I'm interested in, and I'm potentially considering a postdoc in their lab. You know, after talking to them, it's okay to say, hey, I was really interested in this, you know, can I reach out to see, you know, if you have opportunities in your lab? That's perfectly fine, you can make the ask. Or even just say, I'd like to connect with you after the conference. Most researchers are more than happy to do that. Okay, so here are the examples that I'm going to show you. And remember, these are just suggestions. So let's say you're at a networking event. There, it's actually slightly easier because it's a networking event. So most conferences, especially in-person conferences, tend to have these networking events. I have used this one before, actually. I've said, hey, I enjoyed chatting with you. I promised myself I'll talk to at least 3 new people. I'll see you around. Enjoy the rest of the evening. And that's perfectly fine. People are okay with it. You're at a networking event. That's what you're doing. All right, most conferences, at least in-person conferences, have coffee breaks. You've been having coffee, and then when you're having coffee, you just met somebody and you're talking to them. It's okay to say, and this is actually examples I've used. I'd like to find a nice seat at the next talk I'm attending before it fills up. And I say, it was great chatting with you. I'll see you around the conference, right? So you just gracefully exit. And then again, remember, these are just suggestions. Find something that works for you. So here's one where I'm giving you an example where you can actually make an ask. And this is a research in an area you're interested in. An example, I enjoyed chatting with you and hearing more about your work on, and whatever they told you, you repeat that. So they go, oh, you're actually paying attention to what I was saying. That's great. Would it be okay if I reach out via email? And if they've already given you their business contacts, then that's fine. You don't need to say that. And then say, I'm really interested in this area and will appreciate learning more about resources that might be useful, or researchers in this area whose work I should be following. And so that's a way of like making an ask, and it's perfectly fine. Okay. All right, so follow-up. So when I go to conferences, at the end of either a session or in the day, I take notes of people I talk to, people I might want to follow up with afterwards. If you got a business card, you can send them an email, and most of them you can ask them if you could ask them, add them in LinkedIn when you're having this conversation, or if they have a LinkedIn account. And then if you want to add somebody on LinkedIn, don't just do a friend request on LinkedIn. Send a message, say, hey, we met at the conference, give it some context. Don't just do a blind ad. So a while back, I never used to use Twitter. Now it's kind of become a thing academics do. I am on Twitter and I follow people whose research I find interesting on Twitter, but I don't post that much on Twitter. So this is going to depend. Some academics are very prolific on Twitter, some not so much. If they're on Twitter, there's some I follow who just post their research work, and you can go ahead and you can follow them on Twitter. Okay. So continued follow-up. So don't lose touch. You may need those contacts in 3-4 years. You never know. So something I do on people I follow on Twitter, if they publish something I find interesting, I'll send them a note. I read your paper that's it's just a way of keeping touch with them. And then don't overdo it. So remember, this is a professional relationship. So without getting too much into don't say I had a ham sandwich for lunch, which I really like. Obviously I'm being a bit extreme here, but it's a professional relationship. So don't overdo it. Okay, so finally, so these are just other tips and comments. Find what works for you. And then think of it just as getting to know people. It's about forming relationship. Don't think of it as this thing that you have to do to either get a job. Just think of it as just meeting people and forming relationships. And then this is a nice one I've had before, which is don't have more drinks than you have noses. And for those of you without the American context, drinks is alcohol. So don't have more alcohol than you have noses, which means have one. If you're in a professional setting, if you drink alcohol, that is, depending on your tolerance, even if you have high tolerance, my recommendation is just stick to one. I think that was it. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and then we're going to have a small activity so you can practice networking a little bit. But before we do that, are there any questions or comments?
Oh, Gitch, actually, I did have a question. How long should you wait to follow up via like email?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that depends. So I am going to give a response to what I usually do, and then I'll have Layla and Robin jump in as well. So typically, after a conference, so it depends. If it's somebody very close in my area, somebody had like it was a good relationship, and we said something like, hey, let's follow up afterwards. Typically, even at the conference, I can just send a quick email of like, hey, it was nice talking to you. I look forward to like continuing this. If it was something like more casual, and you was like, oh, maybe I'll follow, then I'd maybe wait a day or two after the conference, after like maybe they've gotten back to their home institution and they've settled in. Then like I would send a quick, more of like the thank you note where it was nice meeting at the conference. That's typically how I do it. Robin, Layla?
We're probably pretty similar. I like to do a little bit of a post-conference debrief of like, let me go through my notes. Are there any papers I need to read? All right, is there anyone I should email? And so I'll typically do that a couple days afterwards once I've gotten back, or in the virtual world, once the weekend is over, things like that.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I think, typically everybody has to catch up on things after a conference, particularly if you're traveling. And so it's nice to let that a couple days pass.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to paste an activity. So these are two scenarios. This is one of those that maybe will work really well in person. We'll see how it works virtually. But the goal here is to just have you practice introducing yourself, and then have one or two other people respond as if you're actually like having coffee somewhere. So you can kind of practice doing this. And then something I want you to do is kind of, you can share some things that work for you or don't work for you if you've been in these networking events before. So if it's something that really works for you, just go, hey, something that I usually do. So I'm going to post this in the chat, and then I'm also going to post it on Slack. Should we reshuffle groups, keep them the same?
All right, so it's 2:25, so we're going to go ahead and get started again. Just a few real quick announcements before I hand things off to Robin. So there were a number of questions about the ShowCare site. So it turns out general conference attendees haven't gotten that email yet with that link. That's going to be coming out later today or tonight. So think of this as a preview of what is coming. So you'll be able to get access to that shortly. Another question that came up that I got was asking about whether the other workshops are going to be recorded. And so all of them are going to be recorded, and if the presenters give approval, all of those videos will indeed be uploaded at a later date. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our last section for the day, and I'll hand it off to Robin.
Thank you. Okay. All right, hopefully that's working. Cool. So we're going to just talk a little bit about sort of presenting your work and sort of advocating for yourself in this professional kind of setting, and sort of lumping that in with this term, the elevator pitch. Of course, there will be no elevators. I'll post some of the information on the Slack channel, elevator pitch here, if you want to refer back to some of the guidelines. So I thought I'd just start with an example of sort of like an elevator pitch. I sort of looked around and figured it'd just be better to share one. So here's a little pitch. You can guess if this is my actual research or not. How many of you ate breakfast? Now, everybody knows, especially my mother, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And studies have routinely shown that people who eat breakfast are 83% more likely to be awesome that day. But like so many people, my team faces crippling indecision in the grocery store breakfast aisle or reading the menu at the local pancake house. Now, bad days caused by breakfast choice regret, or BCR, account for 4 billion in lost productivity annually. That's why we developed the Sunrise Decision Maker 4000. Unlike smartphone apps that rely on your memory, the SDM 4000 is wired directly into your prefrontal cortex. Tough to serial decisions are a thing of the past that saves you time, protects your health, and you can start every day with a satisfied foot forward. Anxieties disappear throughout the day, in part because our invasive experimental brain surgery severs those neuronal pathways. Now, most participants don't even miss the ability to see in full color. We're building this platform to make a wide array of decisions instantaneous and worry-free, and we project 200 to 300% increases in productivity, quality of life effects that rival watching YouTube videos of raccoons eating grapes. What are you going to do with those extra minutes of your day? You can do everything because you made the right decision at sunrise. All right, so that was obviously crafted for the opportunity. But, you know, all seriousness present, why do you need something like an elevator pitch? Most of you probably aren't trying to sell a brain implant at this conference. And right now, who's even chatting up a stranger in an elevator? I found this image of somebody's sort of COVID elevator person distribution plan, and notice that everybody's facing like the walls pretty much in this elevator. But conferences are filled with opportunities for these brief encounters. And I think, this fall is nicely after talking about networking. And, after the, hi, my name is, one of the things that you will often talk about is your work. And particularly students and trainees, will be asked, like, what do you work on? What's your research about? What are you interested in? And so it's good to have a response that you've thought about, and that kind of wraps everything up into something that's concise and deliverable. It's good practice at any stage of your career, though, to be able to summarize your work for anybody who asks about it. And even it's good practice for thinking about how you're going to write about your work. There are countless times where you need to provide a simple professional summary of what you're doing, what your work is about, and thinking about and laying it out in a easily communicable way is a good way to practice that. Now, some tips and considerations, and we'll spend a chunk of the time having you all kind of practice and write out some of these. You want to aim for something that's 2 minutes or less. Less is better. You're trying to just sort of spark people's interest and seem enthusiastic and be memorable, and that helps when you're doing those networking reach outs later. So you think about just like, what do you want to say? Start there. What is it that you want somebody to know who hasn't met you or may not know anything about your field? And remember that, it's not really about you, and you're advocating for yourself by talking about the work and interest. But try it. You don't want to say like, I. It's the thing is what should be interesting, and then connect it to you because you're enthusiastic in telling the story. Because you don't know what your audience background may be, you want to try to avoid jargon and technical terms, and describe your work in a way that could be accessible to anybody at the conference or beyond. But you want to kind of engage them. You can think about telling a story. Granted, it's only a minute or two, but give it a little bit of a narrative arc. You can use sort of the like bad news sandwich approach, which I don't know if anybody's seen described before, but sometimes it's described as a way to like deliver bad news to people, where you start with like the good thing, which is like there's this awesome science, and then the bad thing is like a lot of people are sick from X and Y, and then the good thing, like this is what we're doing about it. So you can think about that as a way to craft sort of an interesting way to get people's attention. And you do want to practice these but it's not the kind of thing you want to like memorize, because you want to be able to seem authentic and do it in the moment. And if you're trying to just strictly come off of something that's memorized, it often doesn't come off as genuine or as smooth. And ideally, this is part of a casual conversation that's happening during some of those networking opportunities. The last thing is to be sure that you are also being flexible and know where you can add or remove material depending on the audience and the context. Are you standing at a poster or attending a virtual poster? If you're giving a talk later or presenting a poster later, add that in. Say, hey, come check out my poster, check out my talk, that kind of thing. So being aware of that context and knowing where you can kind of add material or take it away. One way, if you're trying to think about what to include or how to structure it, this is one suggestion way to kind of start crafting it out. And this is how we'll sort of structure it out in the breakout room activity. You can think about, what is the topic? Start big. And then, specifically, what's the question that you're trying to answer? That's usually the problem that you're trying to solve or that you're working on, like the bad thing. And then, like, what are you doing and why is that special? This is where you kind of get to be, show what's unique and what's distinct. And then as you start to sort of zoom back out, why is it worth doing this work and what's your goal? You can kind of end on that high note. So before we go into the breakout rooms, Freddie is also going to give an example of a actual real topic, little elevator pitch. And so I'm going to just stop talking for a moment and Freddie can.
Hi, everybody. So this is, last minute, but that's kind of how you should prep your elevator pitches to be. So I'm going to talk, before going in, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research stuff that I've been doing for the past year. So beyond heredity, that's like, family inheritance and everything, the causes of childhood cancers, really, we don't know enough. It's steeped in really complex genetics. And when we study it, it's kind of like we're walking in the dark. We don't know often why cancer affects kids more in this community, or we don't know why cancer pops up in Black or Latinx or Asian communities more. And with kids, it's, we're stymied by a bunch of different factors that, like, we can't get a neat solution, a neat risk factor like chemical inhalation, because, they're either so young or they haven't had the opportunity to experience smoking or drinking or whatever. So my work at the University of Minnesota is all about risk factors, and it is dedicated to understanding how some risk factors like sex, race, ancestry influence how pediatric cancers kind of crop up and strike. So that's typically done with a technique called differential gene expression analysis. And what that is like looking at how cancer cohorts express their genes differently according to some category or variable to identify, potential targets, or to further get some good answer as to why, white children present with a certain type of cancer more often, but don't die as frequently as others. So my research draws from a lot of different methods. I am a statistician at heart. I'm not a biologist, and I really, really like the opportunity to play with data, but I'm motivated in minority health and improving health equity. So that's kind of why I got into the research. And anyways, we're done with the elevator pitch. And I think that's, that ending note of why are you doing it? What is important to you is also nice to put in there, because we're scientists, but we also bring ourselves into the equation. Why are we studying it is pretty important to at least touch on. Yeah. I'll see you guys in the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Freddie. And the point about why are you doing this and why that's important, I think that's also an element where you can sort of attach your humanity to the work, and that's something that will make people remember you as well. Great, thank you for sharing that. So now it's breakout time. We're going to mix up the rooms, and so the first thing is just to introduce yourself briefly to the group. Probably new people in there, and then take a minute, each person, think about what you're working on and what you'd like to have a pitch for, and just write 1 or 2 sentences that answer each of these questions. Even if you don't end up using those sort of verbatim in a pitch, it helps you structure your thoughts around that and how you can say that concisely. Once you've gotten those, and that may take 5-6 minutes, then as a group is ready, read some of these aloud and see what this sounds like, and see whether people can kind of understand what you're talking about and what's happening there. And if not, just rewrite it, work on it, get some feedback. Are there particular pieces that you're having trouble summarizing? Remember that you want the audience to be interested. They don't have to be able to go and repeat all the work that you're doing. You want them to be sort of hooked and interested. So with that, I will post some of this stuff on the Slack channel so you can refer to it. And I can put it in the Slack. I'm gonna stop sharing right now. And get those breakout rooms going. Great. Well, hopefully, sort of a condensed time to work out some of those. But it's a short thing. It's the elevator pitch, right? You're at an elevator-sized space of time to work on your elevator pitch. But you've got time. It's one of the nice things about doing this workshop before the conference by a few days. So just a couple sort of closing thoughts on that topic. Remember just to know the audience and the context in which you are doing your sort of elevator pitch, and who you're having a conversation with, and what the context is, keeping it in mind, any time constraints and where people might be trying to go, things like that. So just have a little awareness, contextual awareness. And then, so you've given your elevator pitch, and then what? So they might have questions, and be prepared to sort of dive a little deeper and answer any questions. To students and trainees, particularly if you're talking to like a faculty member or something, they love to ask students about like what your future plans are, and so it's just nice to have sort of a response thought about for that, because it gets asked a lot. But either way, remember those networking skills and the topics that Gitch talked about in the last section of this workshop. And if they're not asking questions, then you can use some of those prompts and ask about their work, ask them questions. Remember that people do like to talk about themselves. And I think if sort of that's the end of the conversation, then those exit strategies. But remember to thank people for their time and for listening. You've kind of given them your spiel, and in that sort of networking sense and building those relationships, gratitude goes a long way. So make sure you're grateful for people's time and attention. So you hopefully got at least a start on sort of an outline or a scaffold for describing your work in this condensed format. And so, from here, you just need to fill in some of those gaps, maybe practice, knit those pieces together, and think about how you'll sort of transition your thoughts from in between those different prompts and those sections of the pitch. And just remember, these are some suggestions and examples. One size does not fit all. Like, it may not work to sort of go in that order or answer all the questions that I had sort of proposed. This obviously has to fit your comfort as well and sound natural and comfortable when you're speaking. So these are all flexible guidelines. Practice it a little bit, but most importantly, you want it to be smooth and confident. So test it out, and I think that's sort of a good point to segue into wrapping up here. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to close this. And all right. So in sort of wrapping up this workshop, conferences, they're kind of what you make of them. You can go to as much or frankly, as little as you're motivated. Obviously, once you're there, you kind of want to find the things that are interesting, but also make sure you give yourself some space to just connect with people, talk to people casually, relax, recover. Especially when it's all virtual, it can be really draining to do a lot just back to back. So build in some of that downtime into your plan, and don't forget to have some space in there to interact with people. The Slack portal, I guess you'd call it, Slack group for the first time conference group will be accessible throughout the conference, and you've all met some of the people here that are also new to this conference, presumably, or newer to conferences, and so we'd encourage you to use that as a place to try to maybe schedule a meeting, maybe meet up and talk about the schedules, maybe debrief after some of the keynotes, find a group to practice with or just chat with. And I think if there are procedural questions, we'll kind of keep an eye on the Slack as well. Some things we may not be able to answer directly, but can probably find answers if you're not able to find those elsewhere. So hopefully that can be a helpful resource for navigating the conference as well. I think at this point, I'll see if Gitch or Layla or Freddie have anything to add, and otherwise open it up for any general questions.
Awesome. Well, I guess I'll just sort of finish this out by saying, remember, in addition to the people you've met in breakout rooms today, you've also met the 4 of us that are running this workshop. So keep that in mind and enjoy the conference next week. And we will see you online and eventually someday maybe in person.